Picture this: a winter dawn in the northern woods of Francia. The trees don't tremble from the wind, but from hoofbeats. Far in the mist, steel flashes. They're not here to negotiate. They've come to conquer. That's how the Franks entered history. Not with words, but with iron, blood, and fire. Over 1,000 years ago, they built an empire that made even Rome uneasy. An empire that laid the foundation for medieval Europe. And now, in Age of Empires II, they return. Unchanged, fast, fierce, unforgiving. You might play them for the strongest paladins in the game, or for their cheap castles that drop like thunder. But if you look deeper, you'll see. Each Frankish unit is a piece of real history. From Charlemagne's holy campaigns to cavalry charges that crushed Muslim armies at the Pyrenees. This isn't just a civilization. This is a war cry from the past aimed at the present. Are you ready to ride with them? The year is unknown. The map is generic. But the battle is pure chaos. From the edge of the fog, they come. Armored knights, galloping in formation, shining beneath a dull sun. With every thunderous step, the earth trembles. They crash through pikemen, shrug off arrows, and leave only wreckage behind. Their banners bear no name, only a golden fleur-de-lis. These are not just knights. These are paladins of the Franks. If you've ever played Age of Empires the Sudu, you know this feeling. You've seen these warriors. You've sent them charging across the fields, watched them crush lesser armies with terrifying ease. The Frank civilization doesn't sneak. It doesn't outmaneuver. It charges, like a medieval freight train powered by steel and legacy. But here's the twist. This isn't history. Not really. In AoE 2, the Franks are one of the strongest cavalry civs in the game. They get 20% more HP on all cavalry, cheaper castles, and access to the legendary Paladin upgrade. For casual players, they're forgiving. For pros, they're lethal. But for historians, there's something else entirely. Because the truth is, the Frankish story didn't begin with a charge. It began in the shadows, on the muddy borders of a dying empire. Let's rewind the clock. Not just a few years. Try 15 centuries. The Western Roman Empire is falling apart. Cities once guarded by legions are now exposed, their roads crumbling, their frontiers breached. And beyond those frontiers, across the Rhine and into the thick forests, live the Franks. Not knights, not kings, not even farmers in the way we think. They were tribes, Germanic, fiercely independent, scattered along the river valleys. They fished, hunted, raided, and warred, often with each other. And yet, they watched Rome. They fought it. They traded with it. And when Rome began to fall apart, they didn't just invade. They stepped in. Unlike other tribes that pillaged and moved on, the Franks lingered. They made deals, served as mercenaries, married Roman nobles. Slowly, they began to settle, taking over towns and cities once ruled by imperial governors. And then came Clovis the Bonnier. He wasn't the first Frankish king, but he was the first to matter. Around 481 AD, Clovis inherited a small kingdom in what's now northern France. He was young, ruthless, and smart. He didn't just want to rule. He wanted legacy. So he did something no Frankish leader had done before. He converted to Christianity. To modern ears, this sounds tame. But in the 5th century, this was revolutionary. By choosing Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, not the Arian Christianity of other tribes, Clovis positioned himself as the defender of the true faith. Suddenly, he wasn't just another warlord. He was God's chosen king. The church backed him. Roman citizens welcomed him. And within a generation, Clovis had united most of Gaul under one banner, the Kingdom of the Franks. This was no longer a tribal confederation. It was something new. Something that blended Germanic strength, Roman structure, and Christian ideology into a single force. Over the next 2 centuries, the Franks expanded. They built alliances with the church, established noble families, and developed the roots of what would become medieval feudalism. They created a system in which land meant power, and power required knights, armored warriors loyal to their lords, bound by oaths and armed with steel. And thus, the legend of the Paladin was born. The term Paladin didn't appear until later, during the reign of Charlemagne, Clovis's descendant and the true architect of the Frankish Empire. Charlemagne's court poets wrote of 12 peerless knights, guardians of the realm, champions of God. In reality, these men were generals, governors, and warriors. But in the stories, they became more. Symbols of honor, loyalty, and divine justice. The Paladin wasn't just a knight. He was an idea, a mirror of what a perfect ruler hoped to inspire. And when Age of Empires the Setu launched in 1999, that idea rode again, pixelated and glorious. In AoE 2, the Franks are streamlined to perfection. Their cavalry hits harder, lives longer, and costs the same. Their castles are cheaper, letting them defend and boom faster than almost any other civil. Their economy is simple to manage. And when they reach Imperial Age, they unlock one of the most terrifying units in the game. The Frankish Paladin. He doesn't need fancy upgrades. He doesn't require micro. You build him, and he wins. But here's the catch. That's not how the real Franks won wars. In Civilization 4, you see the Franks from another angle. Usually represented by Charlemagne under the Holy Roman Empire. Their strengths lie in law, religion, and administration. Their buildings reduce upkeep costs. Their traits help them organize empires and defend cities. They don't conquer with cavalry, they conquer with order. It's a slower, more thoughtful game style. Less cinematic, but arguably more true to the lasting legacy of the Frankish world. Because if AoE 2 shows you how the Franks fought, Civ 4 shows you how they endured. So now we stand at the edge of 2 worlds. One, where the Franks charge across open fields, trampling the past, and one, where they rise from it, building a new future out of rubble. Who were the Franks really? Warriors, builders, saints? Or were they somehow all of the above? That's the journey we begin here. Because if you think a Frankish knight is just a pretty pixel on a screen, you haven't met Charlemagne yet. You haven't met Charlemagne yet. Not really. Not the man. Not the myth. Not the empire he carved out of the ashes of everything that came before. Because if Clovis gave the Franks a name, then Charlemagne gave them a soul. He didn't just lead armies. He built an idea. A Europe that didn't belong to Rome or to chaos, but to something entirely new. A Christian empire of laws, learning, and steel. But to understand the man, you must understand his world. And it all began with death. In 768 AD, when his father, Pepin the Short, died, the Frankish kingdom was divided between Charlemagne and his younger brother Charlemagne. Because, of course, nothing was ever simple in medieval succession. 2 brothers, 1 fragile kingdom, and 1,000 enemies at the gates. Lombards in Italy, Saxons in the north, Avars in the east. For a moment, history held its breath. But then, Charlemagne died suddenly, mysteriously some say, and Charlemagne became sole king of the Franks. And with that, the gears began to turn. He wasn't the first warrior king of his age, but he was the first to think like a ruler of continents. Charlemagne waged more than 50 campaigns during his reign. He marched through dense forests, across frozen rivers, over mountains. His most relentless war against the Saxons, a pagan people to the northeast who resisted Christianity with ferocity. And Charlemagne? He fought them not just with swords, but with baptismal fonts. Those who converted lived. Those who didn't. It was brutal. It was holy. It was, in his eyes, necessary. He saw no difference between empire and salvation. To rule the body, he had to claim the soul. But Charlemagne was more than just a sword. Between wars, he built roads, schools, churches. He revived Latin education, gathered scholars at his court, and standardized weights and measures. His capital at Aachen became a beacon of learning in a dark age. He wasn't a Caesar. He wasn't a pope. He was something in between, a new model of power, the Christian emperor. And in the year 800 on Christmas Day, that dream became reality. Inside St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, as Charlemagne knelt in prayer, Pope Leo III placed a crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. It was a stunning moment. The Roman Empire had fallen in the West 3 centuries before. But now, in the person of a Frankish king, it was reborn, not as a pagan institution, but as a Christian vision of empire. This was more than politics. It was myth-making in real time. The Franks were no longer just a people. They were God's chosen empire. In Age of Empires II, Charlemagne never appears by name. There's no Frankish campaign starring him, no cutscene showing the crown in Rome. And yet, his spirit is everywhere. Every time a Frankish paladin tramples an enemy, every time you boom behind cheap castles, every time you build a knight-heavy army and roll over your foes, you're not just playing the Franks, you're playing Charlemagne's dream. Because by now, the Franks weren't just winning wars, they were building legends. At Charlemagne's court, poets and scribes crafted stories of 12 mighty warriors sworn to protect the emperor. They called them Paladins, the palace guard, both literal and symbolic. There was Roland, the fearless, Ogier the Dane, the wise, and many more, some real, most imagined. In these tales, the paladin was more than a soldier. He was chivalry incarnate, brave, devout, unshakable. And though these stories were fiction, they shaped reality. Because knights who read them began to believe they could be that too. And that's why, in Age of Empires II, the Franks are strongest in Castle Age. They represent a civilization that is already unified, already converted, already built the foundations of feudalism and chivalry. They don't start weak like Goths or Celts. They start strong, and they only get stronger. Their knight line is unmatched. Their castles are cheap. Their eco is simple, scalable, lethal. You don't need gimmicks. You don't need micro. You just need to build and believe. That's what makes Frank players dangerous. They play like kings. Meanwhile, over in Civilization IV, Charlemagne leads the Holy Roman Empire, a nod to his true legacy. There, his strength is not in cavalry charges, but in infrastructure. Organized, cheaper civic upkeep, representing his legal reforms. Protective, stronger city defenses, symbolizing his border fortresses and internal stability. You don't rush with Charlemagne. You expand carefully, defend wisely. You play the long game. And in that long game, you endure. Charlemagne died in 814, after 4 decades of rule. He left behind an empire, a legend, and a blueprint. His sons would fight over his legacy. His empire would splinter. But the idea, the dream, that survived. In law, in language, in architecture, in every knight's oath to God and Lord. And in games, pixels and polygons though they may be, his empire rides on. But like all legends, the fall comes next. And in chapter 3, we follow the empire he built as it begins to crack from within. When Frankish hooves thundered across the fields of Europe, they weren't just charging into battle. They were building the bones of an empire. The rise of the Frankish Empire wasn't won by swords alone. It was carried, quite literally, on horseback. From the muddy banks of the Rhine to the sun-drenched plains of Lombardy, the Franks understood one truth better than anyone. A war horse moves faster than a foot soldier, and a knight in armor can turn the tide of a kingdom. But this wasn't always the Frankish way. Charles Martel and the battle that changed everything, back in the early 8th century, the Franks fought mostly on foot. Their warriors were tough, loyal, and wild, but slow. That changed in 732, at the Battle of Tours, when Frankish forces clashed with the fast-moving cavalry of the Umayyad Caliphate. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and on the brink of collapse, the Franks needed a miracle. Instead, they got Charles Martel. Nicknamed the Hammer, Martel wasn't just a general, he was a visionary. After Tours, he saw the writing on the wall. The world was moving, and the Franks needed to move with it. He began reshaping the Frankish military from the ground up, forging a new kind of army, one built around armored cavalry. But cavalry didn't come cheap. Horses, armor, training, it was a rich man's game. So Martel made a decision that would alter the fate of Europe. He seized church lands and redistributed them to nobles in exchange for one thing: mounted warriors. That moment didn't just build a new army, it created a new social order. Knights more than soldiers, symbols of power. These weren't just men in armor, they were the elite. Each knight was a product of wealth, war, and religion. They trained from boyhood, raised war horses from birth, and lived by a brutal code. Loyalty to their lord, devotion to God, and absolute courage in battle. And they didn't fight alone. Every knight brought with him a small army, squires, pages, men-at-arms. To support them all, he needed land, food, and taxes. That's how the knight became the core of the feudal system. In return for their service, they were granted fiefs, turning military strength into political power. Over time, knights became more than weapons. They were symbols of nobility, of law, of the divine right of kings. When Frankish knights rode into battle, they weren't just fighting for territory. They were enforcing hierarchy. They were physical embodiments of order in a chaotic medieval world. Age of Empires the Sioux captures this brilliantly. Playing as the Franks isn't about flexibility, it's about dominance. Their cavalry is king. Their paladins are among the best in the game. Cheaper, with bonus hit points, and devastating in numbers. In historical terms, that reflects centuries of investment in knightly warfare. You don't just build Frankish cavalry, you build your entire empire around them. And it works. Fast, powerful, and shockingly durable. Frankish knights in AoE 2 feel like what they were in real life. Battlefield bulldozers. Then there's the economy. Frankish farms in the game are more efficient, producing more food without constant reseeding. That's no accident. Medieval France had some of the most fertile lands in Europe. That agricultural backbone didn't just feed peasants, it fed war. In a real war economy, food equals soldiers. In AoE 2, it equals knights. Even the chateau, an upgrade that makes castle technologies research faster, mirrors the administrative efficiency under the Carolingians, especially Charlemagne. The Franks weren't just warriors. They were reformers, bureaucrats, and empire builders. On the power and the pitfall, a civilization of extremes. But with every strength comes a shadow. In real history, the Frankish reliance on knights came at a price. Knights were expensive. Training took years, and when they fell, they were hard to replace. Infantry, spears, cheap, replaceable, scalable. But knights? Lose 10 and you've lost a fortune. The same vulnerability exists in AoE 2. A careless Frankish player who goes full cavalry can be punished. Halberdier, basic spear units, can tear through paladins with shocking efficiency. Monks can convert them, archers can kite them. And siege weapons? A few well-placed scorpions can ruin everything. That's the trade-off. With the Franks, you dominate until you don't. When your momentum breaks, it breaks hard. Historically, that's exactly what happened. In the later Middle Ages, as gunpowder, pikes, and infantry tactics evolved, the knight lost his crown. The very image of power became obsolete, outpaced by innovation. But for centuries before that, the knight was king. Mightiest in Civilization 4. The other side of the coin. Now, let's shift platforms to Civilization 4. While not as unit-focused as AoE 2, Civ 4 offers a different lens, cultural and strategic legacy. In Civ 4, the French civilization, heavily inspired by the Franks, is known for its technological edge and culture. Leaders like Louis the Fourrentième emphasize wonders, while Napoleon boosts military production. Here, the cavalry isn't just a unit, it's part of a broader civilization arc. The French unique unit in Civ 4, the Musketeer, comes later in the timeline. But the early game still reflects a similar idea: rapid development, strong military infrastructure, and centralized authority. This echoes the Frankish spirit: strong core cities, loyal nobles, and quick expansion. In Civ 4, the knight is just one part of a toolkit. In AoE 2, the knight is the toolkit. Together, they show two sides of the Frankish coin: the sharp blade and the calculating crown. More legacy beyond pixels. Knights as myth and memory. What Charles Martel began, Charlemagne perfected. What the knights built, the Crusades exported. And what Europe remembers is not just the wars, but the idea of the knight itself. The knight became a myth. Chivalry, honor, glory, romance. From the Song of Roland to Don Quixote, the image endured long after its military usefulness faded. It was never just about the sword. It was about what the sword represented. And that's the real genius of Age of Empires 2. When you pick the Franks, you're not just picking cavalry bonuses. You're stepping into a legacy of thunder and steel. You're riding with Charles Martel. You're building toward Charlemagne. You're wielding the memory of a time when one knight on horseback could change the fate of an empire. Chapter 4. The Crown and the Cross. Charlemagne's Holy Empire. He was not just a king. He was the architect of a civilization. When the dust settled on the battlefields of early medieval Europe, and the last war horns of the Merovingians faded into silence, one name began to rise from the ashes: Charlemagne. His was not a rule of simple conquest, but of transformation. Under his crown, the fractured Frankish tribes became an empire. And under his cross, a brutal warrior king became the father of Europe. But this wasn't destiny. It was design. The making of an emperor. The world Charlemagne inherited was a mosaic of warring tribes, fading Roman ideals, and clashing religions. The Western Roman Empire had fallen nearly 3 centuries earlier, and Europe was, quite frankly, a mess. Literacy was dying. Trade had collapsed. Christianity had no single leader. So when Charlemagne came to power in 768, he didn't just pick up a sword. He picked up the burden of rebuilding a world. Over the next 4 decades, he led over 50 military campaigns, crushing rebellions, repelling Muslim forces in the Pyrenees, subduing Lombards in Italy, and waging a decades-long holy war against the pagan Saxons. But unlike many warlords of the era, Charlemagne fought not just to conquer, but to unify. He believed in order, in hierarchy, in legacy. And so, in the year 800 on Christmas Day, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon Charlemagne's head inside the ancient halls of St. Peter's Basilica, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. It was more than a coronation. It was a resurrection of empire itself. From that moment forward, the Franks were no longer just a tribe. They were the Holy Roman Empire. Empire by sword, unity by script. But Charlemagne didn't just conquer with knights. He ruled with ideas. He launched the Carolingian Renaissance, a rebirth of learning and culture in a time drowning in illiteracy. Schools were opened in monasteries. Latin was standardized. Clergy were taught to write. Documents were copied with precision, and books preserved knowledge that might otherwise have vanished forever. Even the way we write letters today, using clear lowercase and uppercase scripts, was developed during this time. The Carolingian minuscule wasn't just calligraphy, it was civilization, carved in ink. And at the heart of this revival stood a paradox: a warrior king building a world of scholars. Charlemagne knew that knights could defend borders, but only education and faith could hold an empire together. Religion as weapon and armor. Charlemagne's sword bore 2 blades, steel and scripture. He was deeply religious, but also strategically devout. He enforced Christianity not only through preaching, but by force. The Saxons, a fierce Germanic people, resisted conversion for over 30 years. Charlemagne answered with fire and blood, burning pagan shrines, executing rebels, and baptizing survivors by decree. It was both ruthless and revolutionary. His empire became the bridge between church and state, where kings ruled not by lineage alone, but by divine right. It was the birth of the medieval Christian monarch, a ruler blessed by God and feared by men. In many ways, Charlemagne's greatest victory wasn't military. It was ideological. Charlemagne, an age of empires depugna, a symbol, not a civilization. In Age of Empires 2, Charlemagne doesn't exist as a playable civilization, but his legacy is everywhere. The Frankish Scythe inherits the world he shaped. Their focus on cavalry echoes the armored knights who carried Charlemagne's wars from the Pyrenees to the Danube. Their economic bonuses, stronger farms, quicker castle techs, reflect the stability and reform he brought to Europe. Even the game's campaign structure, with castles as bastions of tech and defense, mirrors the real-world Carolingian palaces that served as both royal courts and military strongholds. In essence, when you play the Franks, you're not just fielding paladins, you're fielding an idea. That power must serve both crown and cross. Civilization 4, a different lens on the French legacy. In Civilization 4, the story changes. Here, Charlemagne is actually included, sometimes as a leader of the Holy Roman Empire. His traits? Protective and imperialistic. This aligns well with his historical persona, a ruler focused on defense, expansion, and faith-based administration. The Holy Roman Empire in Civa 4 can build the Rathaus, a cheaper courthouse, representing Charlemagne's bureaucratic reforms. Their unique unit, the Landsknecht, isn't Frankish, but rather later German, showing how Charlemagne's legacy evolved beyond France into the German heartland. Where AoE2 celebrates the knight and castle, Civ 4 celebrates the system. It's not about a single battle. It's about centuries of governance. Strengths and cracks in the crowned Charlemagne built a world on loyalty, faith, and steel. But it was always fragile. After his death in 814, his grand empire began to fracture. His successors lacked his strength, and soon the empire split into three parts: France, Germany, and Italy. The idea of a united Christian empire lived on, but never quite the same. This is reflected in both games. In AoE 2, you might dominate the early and mid-game with cavalry, but a smart enemy who survives long enough can out-tech you. In Civ, however, even the mightiest imperialist can fall to cultural resistance or economic decay. The lesson? Even the greatest empires must adapt or die. The emperor behind the Paladins, Charlemagne, remains one of history's greatest what-ifs. What if his empire had lasted? What if his successors had been stronger? What if Europe had stayed united under one Christian crown? And yet, maybe that was never the point. His legacy isn't measured by borders. It's measured by ideas, by a revival of learning in a dark time, by a fusion of faith and state that shaped all of medieval Europe, by the code of the knight, the rise of the castle, and the belief that kings should be more than conquerors. They should be builders. In game terms, he is the DNA of every cavalry charge, every booming economy, every campaign for faith and conquest. In human terms, Charlemagne was a contradiction. A brutal warlord who adored scholars, a pious Christian who converted by the sword, a tribal king who dreamed like a Roman emperor. And sometimes, contradictions build the greatest legacies. Chapter 5. The Fall and the Fracture, from Empire to Feudal Chaos. Shuang Vaim, Su Sup Jova Chia Kat, Tu Je Che Jen Hon Loan Fong Kien. It was not a sword that broke Charlemagne's empire. It was inheritance. When Charlemagne died in 814, he left behind more than a vast empire. He left a question. Who could possibly hold together what he had built? His son Louis the Pious inherited the imperial mantle, but not the charisma nor iron-fisted control of his father. And when Louis passed, the Carolingian world was shattered by one of the most fateful mistakes in medieval history: the division of the empire among his sons. The Treaty of Verdun in 843, once meant to preserve peace among Charlemagne's grandsons, instead planted the seeds for centuries of bloodshed. The empire was carved like meat at a royal feast. West Francia, East Francia, and Middle Francia. From those pieces, modern France and Germany would eventually rise. But for now, what emerged was chaos, distrust, and open warfare. This was the moment the Franks stopped being an empire and started becoming feudal lords. Lords without borders gone were the grand imperial campaigns uniting the Franks under a single banner. In their place rose local lords, each with their own ambitions and private armies. Castles dotted the landscape like mushrooms after rain, not as monuments to glory, but as fortresses of fear. No longer did kings rule as absolute emperors. They bargained, threatened, and relied on oaths that were broken as often as they were made. Feudalism, though often romanticized in modern media, was born not from honor, but from weakness. The royal court, once the heart of Charlemagne's empire, became a stage for scheming nobles. Land was no longer held in service to a unified state. It became currency for loyalty and sometimes betrayal. And into this fragmented world came a new storm from the north: the Viking wave. Starting in the late 800s, Norse longships began to claw at the edges of West Francia. Unlike the structured armies of past Roman enemies, The Vikings were unpredictable, fast, and brutal. They targeted monasteries, burned towns, and demanded tribute. They even sailed up the Seine and sacked Paris, twice. In the face of this terror, the fractured Frankish nobility showed its worst. Internal squabbling, refusal to unite, and deals with the enemy. Some lords even paid the Vikings to raid their rivals instead. It was during this chaos that the foundations of the future French monarchy were quietly laid. A warrior named Robert the Strong, ancestor of the Capetian dynasty, began organizing resistance. His son and grandson would eventually become kings, not by divine right, but because they could hold a sword and survive. From empire to kingdom. By the 10th century, the Carolingian name had faded into insignificance. In 987, Hugh Capet, a man with royal blood but no Carolingian claim, was crowned King of the Franks. It was a modest title, one that barely covered the lands he truly controlled. But it marked a turning point. The idea of a unified France was reborn, not through empire, but through survival. Yet the shadows of Charlemagne's empire never fully vanished. Each new ruler of West Francia, and later France, tried to recapture that golden age. But what they inherited wasn't just a memory. It was a world broken into baronies, duchies, and endless rivalry. Feudal chaos in Civilization IV and Age of Empires Thessaloniki. In Civilization IV, this collapse of centralized power is often modeled through the concept of war weariness, maintenance costs, and civics like vassalage or decentralization. A once mighty empire starts to falter when internal unrest and external threats collide. The French civilization in the game, often represented by leaders like Louis XIV or Napoleon, doesn't reflect this early medieval chaos, but it's felt through the need to survive barbarian waves and manage early cities with limited loyalty. In Age of Empires II, the Franks are introduced as a powerful cavalry civilization, but there's a telling absence. No imperial architecture, no grand siege engines in their unique tech tree. Instead, the Franks rely on strong knights, cost-efficient castles, and foraging bonuses. All nods to a feudal society trying to hold on to wealth and control amidst constant external threats. Their tech tree isn't the mark of a golden empire, but of a fractured realm defending what's left. The strength and weakness of fragmentation history paints feudal France as disorganized, even backward. But that would be a mistake. Fragmentation, while politically chaotic, allowed for pockets of innovation. Local lords began investing in literacy for clergy, building stone churches, and experimenting with land management. The very weakness of central authority made room for strong regional cultures to emerge. But with it came tragedy too. Endless petty wars, peasant revolts, and lawlessness in the countryside defined the lives of ordinary people. A man might never know who truly ruled his village, only who collected his taxes. Legacy of the fracture. The fall of the Carolingian Empire was not the end of the Franks. It was their metamorphosis. What emerged from the ruins was a new kind of power, not imperial, but personal. Lords ruled not by law, but by sword. Kings survived not by decree, but by diplomacy. It was messy, brutal, and deeply human. And it is this transition, from the imperial glory of Charlemagne to the fragmented resilience of feudal France, that sets the Franks apart in both history and game design. They were not always unified, but they endured. And in that endurance, they left behind something more enduring than empire: a civilization. Chapter 6. The Capetian Climb. From shadows to sovereigns. They were not born to rule. They seized the moment when no one else could. The Carolingian dynasty, the bloodline of Charlemagne, had faded into a pale memory by the end of the 10th century. The empire that once stretched across Europe was now a ghost, haunting the ambitions of lesser men. Power had fractured, dissolved into the hands of dukes, counts, and bishops who swore loyalty only to themselves. France, if it could still be called that, was a chessboard of ambition where kings reigned in name but barely ruled in practice. And then came Hugh Capet, a man of small domain and even smaller fame. A crown with no power in 987, after the death of the last Carolingian king, the nobles of West Francia gathered, not to elect a mighty warlord or a visionary ruler, but to choose someone weak enough not to threaten their autonomy. Hugh Capet was perfect. He had royal lineage, but no true claim. He was respected, but not feared. But what the Lord saw as weakness, Hugh saw as opportunity. He knew his crown was little more than a gilded ornament. His control barely extended beyond the Île-de-France, the small region around Paris. But he also knew this: if he could survive long enough, if his son could inherit the throne, and if that throne could be passed on without chaos, then maybe, just maybe, a dynasty could be born. This was not a story of conquest. It was a story of strategic patience. The age of quiet kings. For the next 2 centuries, the Capetians reigned like shadows. They didn't storm castles or redraw maps overnight. Instead, they married strategically, forged pacts, and slowly pulled rebellious vassals into their orbit. While the Plantagenets in England made dramatic moves across the Channel, the Capetians dug deep into the soil of France, rooting themselves in tradition and legitimacy. And here's the strange truth: sometimes doing nothing was their greatest weapon. The dukes and counts who had once laughed at Hugh Capet's feeble reach began to notice something. The Capetian kings never left. Other houses rose and fell, but the Capets endured. Kingship, once a game of chance and swordplay, became something else: a lineage, a tradition, a slow burning fire that refused to die. Game mechanics, long play in Civilization 4. In Civilization 4, this long game is reflected not through conquest, but through cultural influence, diplomacy, and the passage of time. The French civilization, under leaders like Louis XIV, doesn't explode early. They evolve, quietly gaining power through wonders, alliances, and city loyalty. The Capetians are like a Civ player who avoids early wars, builds infrastructure, stacks up great people points, and waits for the Renaissance to unleash their golden age. It's not flashy, but it wins games. Faith, legitimacy, and the sword religion was another tool in the Capetian arsenal. While other nobles flaunted their independence, the Capets clung to the church. They positioned themselves as protectors of the faith, allies of the Pope, and chosen by God. In a world obsessed with divine right, this wasn't just symbolism, it was strategy. But they weren't pacifists. Kings like Philip the First, Louis VI, and especially Philip II Augustus began expanding royal authority through both diplomacy and force. By the 12th century, the Capetian kings were no longer just figureheads. They were monarchs who could summon armies, siege castles, and dictate terms. The turning point came with the crushing of the Angevin Empire, the vast English-controlled lands that stretched across western France. At the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, Philip II's forces defeated a coalition of English, Flemish, and German enemies. It wasn't just a military victory. It was the moment France became a true kingdom again. AOE2 transition, from Franks to France. In Age of Empires the Scudo, the Franks are represented as a cavalry-heavy civilization. a nod to their feudal and chivalric traditions. But they also get strong castles and bonuses to farming, reflecting the slow, stable buildup of a centralized French monarchy. It's not about overwhelming early aggression. It's about resilience, resource control, and tech advantages in the late game. Much like the Capetians, a Frankish player wins not by flash, but by outlasting, outgrowing, and outmaneuvering rivals. A new identity emerges. By the 13th century, France had changed, not just politically, but spiritually. The Capetian kings began shaping a new identity, the nation-state. They standardized language in their courts, issued royal edicts, and established bureaucracies. The king was no longer first among equals. He was the embodiment of France itself. And the people? For the first time in centuries, they began to think of themselves not just as vassals of a local lord, but as subjects of a king. This shift was revolutionary. It paved the way for everything that would come. The 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc, the rise of Paris, and eventually the absolute monarchy of the Bourbons. But none of that would have been possible without the quiet, calculated climb of the Capetians. Legacy in game and history. The Franks in Age of Empires the Secu and the French in Civilization the Four reflect this unique journey. They are not the world's conquerors like the Mongols. They're not the builders of wonders like the Egyptians. They are survivors, political shapeshifters who turned weakness into endurance. In-game, they reward players who understand timing, development, and positioning. In history, they rewarded a people who longed for order in a world gone mad. From ashes to crown, the story of the Franks doesn't end with Charlemagne. It evolves. It fragments. It reforms. Through chaos, they found patience. Through patience, they found legacy. And through legacy, they transformed from feuding lords into sovereign kings. When you play the Franks in Age of Empires the Skinks or Lidu, the French in Civilization therefore, you're not just commanding an army. You're carrying the legacy of kings who learned to rule not through conquest alone, but through time. In the next chapter, The Flame of War, how the Franks faced England in the 100 Years' War. Chapter 7. The Flame of War. The 100 Years' Struggle for a Crown. It began with a question: who owns the crown? It ended with a century of blood. The year was 37. Across the English Channel, two kingdoms stared each other down like wolves circling a carcass. The Capetian dynasty, after centuries of careful rule, had reached a dead end. The last male heir had died. And in the vacuum left behind, a flame was lit. A flame that would engulf France for over 100 years. England claimed the crown. France denied them. What followed wasn't just a war. It was an identity crisis written in steel and fire. The claim that shook the world. Edward III of England had blood ties to the French throne through his mother, Isabella, the daughter of the late King Philip IV of France. When Charles IV died in 1328 without a male heir, Edward believed the crown should pass to him. But the French nobles refused. Citing Salic law, they argued that the throne could not pass through a female line. Instead, they crowned Philip VI, a cousin from the House of Valois. Edward was outraged, and in 1337, he did the unthinkable. He declared himself King of France. It was a challenge not just to Philip VI, but to French sovereignty itself. The War of Styles. The 100 Years' War wasn't one long, continuous battle. It was a series of campaigns, truces, betrayals, and uprisings that spanned generations. Each phase brought new kings, new commanders, and new horrors. But at its heart, it was a war of two different visions of monarchy. The English kings ruled with centralized strength, backed by parliament and a battle-hardened nobility. The French kings, though older in lineage, struggled with rebellious vassals and fractured loyalties. And on the battlefield, this clash of styles became painfully clear. Agincourt, where the earth drank blood. In 1415, a sickly and outnumbered English army landed in Normandy. Led by King Henry V, they marched through mud, pursued by a French force 3 times their size. The French knights, emboldened by numbers and pride, believed victory was certain. But what happened at Agincourt changed the course of history. Using longbows, narrow terrain, and discipline, the English slaughtered the French nobility. Over 6,000 French died that day, many of them nobles in shining armor, cut down by arrows before they ever reached the enemy. It was a humiliation, a moment when the chivalric dream of France shattered under the weight of English tactics. In Age of Empires the Second, Britons versus Franks in Age of Empires the Two, this clash is perfectly symbolized in multiplayer matches. Britons with their deadly longbowmen, and Franks with their charging paladins. Agincourt plays out again and again in these digital fields. The Britons kite and fire, while the Franks charge and bleed. It's not just a game, it's a recreation of one of history's most lopsided victories. But history doesn't end in one battle. The Rise of a Maid. By 1429, the war had dragged on for nearly a century. France was broken. The English controlled vast territories in the north. Morale was gone. Hope had fled. And then came a girl. Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, was a peasant, illiterate, barely 17. She claimed to hear voices, visions from saints urging her to save France, to lead an army, to crown the true king, Charles VII, at Reims. It sounded like madness, but desperation has a way of turning belief into action. And when she appeared at the siege of Orléans, dressed in armor, bearing a white banner, the French soldiers followed her. They won. Her victories, though few, changed everything. She lit a spiritual fire the English could never extinguish. France had found a symbol, not of power, but of purpose. The real power of inspiration. Joan was captured in 1430, sold to the English, and burned at the stake in Rouen. But in death, she became larger than life. The flame that had once consumed France now turned on its enemies. Charles VII, once mocked as the King of Bourges, began reclaiming lost territory. By 1453, with the fall of Bordeaux, the English had been pushed out of all of France, except Calais. The war was over, not with a treaty, but with silence. From fracture to nation, France had paid dearly, over 3 million dead, villages burned, fields left fallow, generations lost. But it had gained something too, a soul. For the first time, the French people saw themselves not just as subjects of lords, but as part of a shared destiny. The war had forged a national identity, one built not on titles or blood, but on struggle, survival, and sacrifice. Game reflections. Why the Franks endure. In Age of Empires, the Franks don't always shine early. They lack ranged power. They don't dominate in water. But in the late game, when they unleash paladins at low cost and fortify with cheaper castles, they become almost unstoppable. Much like in history, their strength is not in aggression, but in resurgence. They bend, but they do not break. Legacy of the 100 Years' War. The war didn't just shape France, it reshaped Europe. England turned inward, leading to the War of the Roses. France centralized power under a strengthened monarchy. The age of chivalry ended. The age of gunpowder and modern nation-states began. And in that long, painful crucible, the Franks were reborn, not as feudal lords or divided dukes, but as a unified kingdom ready for a new era. A final thought: the 100 Years' War teaches us that sometimes the longest wars are not about land. They're about meaning, about who we are, who gets to rule, who gets to dream. And when you play the Franks in Age of Empires II, remember, you're not just leading a civilization, you're carrying the weight of a crown that took 100 years to earn. But as the war dragged on into the late 14th century, something began to shift. The balance of power once tilted firmly in favor of the English. Longbowmen and their mobile cavalry began to erode. France, fractured but not defeated, adapted. And in adaptation, the Franks found rebirth. Under Charles V, the French crown reorganized. No longer chasing the English into costly open-field battles, the French embraced a new war of attrition. Skirmishes replaced sieges. Castles were refortified, taxation was overhauled, and militias were better equipped. The king didn't seek glory on the battlefield. He sought endurance. And in that, he laid the groundwork for a new kind of warfare. In Age of Empires II, this mirrors a transition in playstyle. Early game aggression with cavalry might define a Frankish start, but longevity requires economy. The Franks' farm bonus, cheaper castles, and powerful paladins only shine in the late game if the player survives the grind. Charles V, in a way, played the eco game. Meanwhile, the tides of war in real life turned dramatically with the emergence of unlikely heroes, none more iconic than a teenage girl from Domremy, Jeanne d'Arc. Joan of Arc wasn't born into nobility. She didn't wield a sword with the finesse of a knight or hold titles passed down from royal blood. But what she did possess was vision, both spiritual and strategic. Her belief in divine guidance propelled her to convince Charles VII to give her command. And in 1429, she would lift the siege of Orléans, not with brute force, but with faith, morale, and unity. To the English, she was a witch. To the French, a savior. And to history, a fulcrum. In AoE 2, the Joan of Arc campaign is more than a tribute. It's a microcosm of how leadership, momentum, and morale can change the course of empires. Joan's missions aren't won by superior technology. They're won through timing, movement, and heart. Her presence even in-game boosts the morale of troops, echoing her historical charisma. But Joan's flame burned fast and bright. Captured, tried, and executed by the English in 1431, she became a martyr. Yet her death didn't extinguish the movement. She had lit a fire that would smolder in the hearts of the French for generations. And that's the thing about civilizations. You can decimate their armies, raze their castles, scatter their kings, but you cannot always kill belief. By 1453, after over a century of bloodshed, the 100 Years' War ended. England was expelled from all major French territories except Calais. The Frankish legacy remained intact, but not unchanged. The Kingdom of France emerged not just as a victor, but as a nation. The feudal shards once scattered across duchies and rival houses were slowly reassembled into a centralized monarchy. This centralization is perhaps the final evolution of the Frankish identity. No longer just a patchwork of knights and villages, France would become a beacon of Renaissance power, culture, and centralized might. And so, in the game, as in history, the Franks are a civilization of growth, of humble beginnings and noble ideals, of cavalry and cathedrals. but also of endurance. They reward players who know when to charge, when to wait, and when to rebuild. Their paladins are among the strongest in the game, much like how the Frankish knights came to define chivalry. Their castles come cheaper, just as their real-world counterparts relied on fortifications to weather the long storms of war. Their lack of access to gunpowder and arbalèsts might seem like a disadvantage, but it forces a return to roots, cavalry, and courage. Yet in Civilization IV, the narrative is different. Here, France, often symbolizing the Franks in a broader sense, leans more into culture and diplomacy. Leaders like Louis XIV and Napoleon reflect very different eras, but they share something deeply Frankish: ambition. In Civ IV, it's not always about war, it's about influence, about winning hearts, spreading ideals, and outlasting opponents not through firepower, but finesse. So what does this say about the Franks? That their story isn't singular. It evolves, it fractures, it reforms. They are knights and kings, saints and scholars. They are swords drawn in the mud of Agincourt and prayers whispered at Reims. In games, they teach us the art of balance. In history, they show us the price of endurance. And perhaps most importantly, the Frankish journey reminds us that every civilization, whether pixelated on a battlefield or etched into the chronicles of time, is shaped not just by conquest, but by crisis, by how it responds when its world falls apart. In the next chapter, we'll explore how that world would indeed fall apart again. Because victory on the battlefield doesn't guarantee peace, and the Frankish dream of unity would be tested not by foreign invaders, but by their own blood. Next chapter: From Glory to Guillotine, the Bourbons and the Price of Power. Chapter Eound: The Fractured Kingdom, Religious Wars and the Echo of Unity. It was a time when the streets of Paris ran red, not with the blood of foreign invaders, but with that of neighbors, friends, and families torn apart by faith. The once proud kingdom of the Franks, which had forged unity under the banner of Charlemagne and galloped across Europe with divine purpose, was now crumbling from within. The enemy no longer wore foreign colors. They sat at the same dinner tables and worshipped the same God in different tongues. The 16th century brought fire and fury not from without, but from within the soul of the Frankish legacy. Protestantism had swept across Europe like a wind in a dry forest. And in France, it ignited one of the most catastrophic series of civil wars in European history: the French Wars of Religion. Between 1562 and 1598, France was not one nation, but a fractured mosaic of Catholic and Huguenot territories, cities under siege, and castles turned into fortresses against former allies. The massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572 was the darkest chapter of this religious schism. What began as a royal wedding meant to unite Catholic and Protestant nobility devolved into a bloodbath that left thousands dead. Bodies floated down the Seine. The bells of Notre Dame rang not for joy, but for executions. Paris was gripped by fear, and the promise of unity under God now seemed like a cruel joke. And yet, amidst the carnage, a figure emerged, a man who would reframe the idea of kingship in France. Henri of Navarre, a Protestant by birth, fought not just with sword and shield, but with a vision of pragmatic peace. In 1593, he famously converted to Catholicism, declaring, "Paris is well worth a mass." This single decision, a masterstroke of political realism, paved the way for the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting limited religious freedom to Huguenots and ending decades of war. Henri IV wasn't just a peacemaker, He was a reformer. He reinvigorated the royal infrastructure, curbed noble power, and poured resources into rebuilding the war-torn countryside. In a sense, he carried forward the spirit of Charlemagne, not through conquest, but through reconstruction. He saw the nation as a garden that needed tending, not a battlefield to dominate. In doing so, he reassembled the fractured soul of France, if only for a time. But how does this era of religious conflict and pragmatic peace map onto the world of Age of Empires II or Civilization IV? In Age of Empires II, the Frankish civilization is celebrated for its chivalric glory. Paladins charging with unmatched strength, castles standing proud on the front lines, and a booming economy thanks to cheap farms and resilient villagers. The game reflects the height of Frankish power. The Crusades, the Age of Knights, the romanticized Middle Ages. But what it doesn't capture is the internal decay. The chaos that followed when the sword of the knight no longer pointed outward, but inward. The Franks in AoE 2 don't suffer from religious tension. There's no civil unrest mechanic. Your units obey, your cities flourish, and your castles never rebel. It's a sanitized version of the legacy, a golden dream untouched by the brutal realities of Reformation-era France. It's exhilarating gameplay, but historically, it's only half the story. Civilization of IV, however, nudges closer to the complexities of this era. With religion as a core gameplay mechanic, players can adopt state religions, spread them through missionaries, or trigger wars based on religious divides. Civil wars don't occur directly, but diplomatic penalties, city revolts, and culture wars mimic the historical tension. If you choose to play as France and adopt different religions across your cities, you may feel a microcosm of Henri IV's dilemma: how to rule a divided people without losing the crown. Still, no game fully captures the haunting reality of a nation at war with itself. That sense of brothers turning against brothers, of cities starving not because of foreign siege, but due to mistrust and sabotage from within. And yet, this pain was pivotal. It reshaped what it meant to be Frankish. No longer just a warrior noble with a cross on his chest, but a king who could wield compromise as deftly as a blade. Henri IV's Edict of Nantes was not the end of the Frankish story, but a turning point. It was the realization that unity in belief was no longer possible, but unity in law perhaps was. It was a shift from the medieval ideal of one faith, one king, one sword, to a more modern France, fractured in faith, but stitched together by tolerance and law. In the following decades, France would pivot again, toward absolutism under Louis XIV. The Edict of Nantes would eventually be revoked, and religious tolerance snuffed out in favor of centralized power. The pendulum swung, as it always does in history. But the era of the religious wars left deep scars, and in those scars, we see the evolution of a civilization that refused to die. The Frankish identity, forged in conquest and faith, was tempered in fire once more. But this time, it was a fire they set upon themselves. And yet, from those ashes rose a new kind of resilience. Not the armored knight charging into glory, but the statesman navigating impossible divides. And that, perhaps, is the truest legacy of the Franks. Not just their victories on the battlefield, but their ability to survive their own collapse, adapt, and emerge transformed. Chapter 9. The Sun King's Shadow. From Versailles to Revolution. The clatter of hooves was gone. The clang of swords silenced. France no longer roared with the fury of knights or the cries of religious martyrs. Instead, it shimmered, golden, glittering, controlled. At the center of it all stood a man who didn't just rule, he radiated. Louis XIV, the Sun King. He didn't inherit Charlemagne's sword or Henri IV's pragmatism. He forged something new entirely, a kingdom orbiting around his will. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a monument to absolute power. In every chandelier, every painted ceiling, and every ornate garden path was a message. I am France. While Age of Empires II ends its portrayal of the Franks by the High Middle Ages, the real historical arc continues, more dazzling and dangerous than ever. The warrior kings gave way to royal architects of illusion and control. Louis XIV turned the battlefield into a stage and the nobility into spectators, caged in luxury and chained by etiquette. But behind the curtains of Versailles, the ground was shifting. Under Louis, France became the most powerful kingdom in Europe, not by expanding borders through knights, but through diplomacy, marriage, and wealth. Yet this strength was hollow at its core. The countryside that once fed knights now fed taxes into royal coffers. The peasantry, once called to arms in the name of faith, now suffered in silence, forgotten in the shadows of opulence. The Franks of the early game in AoE 2 thrive on strong castles and cavalry, visible external displays of power. But what Louis XIV created was an invisible fortress, one made of court rituals, centralized bureaucracy, and surveillance masked as theater. You couldn't rebel against what you couldn't even touch. In this era, the sword had become the pen, the general replaced by the minister. In the Civilization series, this would be the point where France maxes out its culture score, building wonders, accumulating great artists, and dazzling the world with diplomacy and beauty. But as any experienced player knows, a high culture score doesn't always mean internal stability. Because behind the gilded doors, resentment brewed. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, France had stretched itself too far. Endless wars, especially the War of the Spanish Succession, drained the treasury. Louis's reign had begun in splendor, but ended in exhaustion. The people, once dazzled, were now disillusioned. Grain prices soared, taxes crippled the commoner, and whispers began to grow louder across taverns and marketplaces. Yet Versailles still danced. To understand the looming storm, you have to understand how far the kingdom had come from its roots. The early Franks were warriors, crude, brutal, but present. Louis XIV's France was ethereal, powerful but disconnected, wrapped in silk, removed from the soil that fed it. This disconnection would be fatal. When Louis died in 1715, he left behind the most admired monarchy in Europe and the most unstable. His successors, notably Louis XV and then Louis XVII, inherited a throne elevated too high to hear the cries below. They governed not a united Frankish kingdom, but a pressure cooker of social classes, religious divisions, and economic desperation. By the late 18th century, the spirit of the Frankish knights was but a myth. The once proud warrior elite had become either idle aristocrats or broken veterans. The castles, symbols of safety in AoE 2, now symbolized oppression. And in Paris, the capital of the world's most magnificent monarchy, a different kind of revolution brewed. Not one of conquest, but of reckoning. 1789. The Bastille fell. Heads rolled where crowns once rested. Versailles, once a symbol of absolute power, became a museum of faded glory. The people, the ones forgotten by paladins and sun kings alike, took the reins of history. If you were to simulate this in Age of Empires II, it would look like a late-game betrayal. A booming economy, powerful military, fully upgraded castles. And then, suddenly, your villagers revolt. Your castles are overrun, and your strongest units turn against you. Not because your opponent outplayed you, but because you forgot your foundation. That's what happened to the legacy of the Franks. They built a world of grandeur, of faith, of honor. But they lost the connection to the people who made that world possible. And when the reckoning came, it wasn't from rival civilizations. It was from within their own borders, their own kitchens, their own wheat fields. The French Revolution was not just the end of a monarchy. It was the end of a myth. The myth that kings ruled by divine right, that castles could protect forever, that knights and nobles would always be obeyed. The revolution took that myth, shattered it, and replaced it with something new, uncertain, and infinitely more dangerous. The idea that power belongs to the people. From the battlefield of Tours to the gardens of Versailles, the Frankish journey had been long, glorious, and tragic. In Age of Empires 2, it ends in victory screens, shining banners, and triumphant paladins. But in history, it ended in blood-soaked streets, burning symbols, and a republic born from fire. And yet, this too was not the end. Because in the chaos of revolution, from the very soil that once crowned kings, a new figure would rise. A man who would resurrect the old ambition under a new name. A man who would take the fractured, burning remains of France and turn them into an empire that once again terrified the world. His name was Napoleon. But that is a story for another chapter. Chapter X. Napoleon. The final echo of the Frankish Empire. The thunder of cannon replaced the whispers of the court. Smoke now clung to Europe's fields like a second skin. And at the center of this storm stood a man, neither king nor noble, who would redefine what it meant to be French. Napoleon Bonaparte. He didn't rise on horseback in shining armor. He rose from chaos, crafted not by lineage but by merit, genius, and ambition sharper than any sword. In the wake of the revolution's guillotine, where heads of kings tumbled like dice, Napoleon stepped in, not as a savior of monarchy, but as the architect of empire. If Charlemagne was the beginning of the Frankish idea of unification through force and faith, Napoleon was its final echo. One last explosion of imperial ambition before modernity swept it all away. Let's be clear. By Age of Empires the Sekou standards, Napoleon belongs to a different game. His cannons, muskets, and supply chains are more Empire Earth or Age of Empires 3. But symbolically, he is the ultimate late-game power spike, a civilization in its final form, not built on tradition, but on adaptation. And like the Franks in AoE 2, his strength came from mobility, resilience, and one devastating truth. He fought differently. While the medieval Franks relied on armored cavalry and fortified castles, Napoleon wielded corps d'armée, independent, self-sufficient fighting machines that moved faster, hit harder, and adapted quicker than anything Europe had seen. This wasn't war as honor. It was war as math, as movement, as momentum. In Age of Empires the Sekou, when you reach the Imperial Age, the goal is simple: dominate. Napoleon did just that. He steamrolled monarchies, shattered alliances, and forced ancient empires to kneel. His campaigns weren't just military conquests, they were ideological invasions. Wherever he went, he brought the fire of the revolution in one hand and the iron of empire in the other. But like any overextended player, he didn't know when to stop. His reign, though brilliant, was built on exhaustion. France had bled through decades of revolution and war. While the Franks of old expanded slowly, across generations, Napoleon tried to do it all in one lifetime. From Italy to Egypt, from Prussia to Spain, His armies marched like a tide. But tides, no matter how powerful, eventually recede. Then came Russia. In game terms, this was the classic late-game blunder, pushing too deep into enemy territory without securing your supply lines. The winter of 1812 wasn't just cold, it was catastrophic. The Grande Armée melted into the snow, not from defeat on the battlefield, but from hunger, frostbite, and hubris. Napoleon's fall was swift. One moment, Europe trembled before him. The next, he was exiled, twice. And yet, even in defeat, his legacy burned bright. He had shattered the old world. The Holy Roman Empire? Gone. Feudalism? Dismantled. The divine right of kings? Laughable. In his place, Napoleon left a new kind of empire, not just of land, but of law, identity, and nationalism. Where the early Franks had forged unity through conversion and conquest, Napoleon gave Europe a taste of modernity, meritocracy, codified laws, and national pride. It was messy, it was violent, but it was irreversible. He also revived the image of the imperial warrior. In a way, he brought back the glory of the old Frankish paladin, not in chainmail, but in uniform and bicorn hat. He was both general and myth, soldier and emperor, Caesar and Charlemagne reborn. The French people, who had torn down kings just years earlier, now embraced an emperor of their own making. Why? Because unlike Louis XVI, Napoleon earned their loyalty. He didn't inherit his crown. He took it, famously, placing it on his own head at Notre Dame, denying even the Pope the right to crown him. That single gesture summed up the new world he had forged, the age of self-made empires. But all empires fall, even the greatest ones. After Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon was finally defeated, for good. The monarchs returned, the map of Europe was redrawn, and the dream of a united Europe faded once again. But the idea, the spirit of Napoleon didn't die. Just like the Frankish legacy in Age of Empires, the SKU, his influence echoed long after his army was gone. Across Europe, his reforms remained. His name inspired revolutions. His strategies were studied by generals for centuries. And most importantly, he proved something terrifying. One man could reshape the world. That idea, born from the ashes of the revolution and fueled by centuries of Frankish ambition, was now unstoppable. In gaming terms, Napoleon was a civilization in overdrive. Fueled by momentum, crippled by attrition, but unforgettable in its impact. He didn't just play the game. He broke it, rewrote the meta, and left behind a blueprint for every future empire builder. When we look back on the Franks in Age of Empires II, we often freeze them in time as knights, castles, and glory. But their journey stretched far beyond the medieval fields of France. It crossed into palaces, parliaments, and battlefields soaked in cannon smoke. It evolved, adapted, and, finally, imploded. Napoleon was the final echo of that saga. After him, France would never again be the center of a vast empire. But it would become something perhaps even more enduring, a republic with memory, a nation forever haunted and inspired by its past. Chapter 11th. Legacy of the Franks. From Age of Kings to the digital empire. In the end, all empires fall, but some never truly die. Their warriors turn into legends, their cities become ruins, and their names, carved in history, echo into the future. The Franks were once flesh and blood. They rode into battle beneath fluttering banners. They crowned emperors in candlelit cathedrals. They fought for God, for gold, for glory. Now they ride again, but not on horseback. They return through pixels, in Age of Empires the Scudo. And this time, you are the commander. When Ensemble Studios released Age of Kings in 1999, they didn't just build a strategy game. They resurrected history. They turned dusty textbooks into interactive sagas, letting players shape the past from their own throne room, mouse in hand, headset on. Among the 13 original civilizations, the Franks stood out. Not because they had the flashiest units, not because they had the most tech, but because they carried something deeper: legacy. Their identity in the game is laser-focused on one thing: cavalry dominance. From the early feudal age to late-game imperial wars, the Franks teach you one rule: strike fast, strike hard, control the map, and never stop moving. Their free farm upgrades reflect the fertile lands of old Frankish Gaul, rich, resilient, and ever-growing. Their cheap castles echo the military architecture of Charlemagne's Europe, a realm defended by stone and steel. Their paladins, with extra HP, are more than just cavalry. They are modern echoes of mounted legends like Roland, who fell at Roncevaux Pass but rose again in song. In game terms, they're a powerhouse. In storytelling terms, they're a resurrection. But the brilliance of Age of Empires II is that it doesn't just give you history, it gives you power over history. When you choose the Franks, you inherit the legacy of centuries, but you also rewrite it. Want to rush enemy economies with scouts? You can. Turtle up behind castles like it's the 9th century? Be my guest. Charge into battle with 50 paladins flanking from both sides. That's the dream. You're not just replaying history, you're playing with it. And in that choice, something magical happens. The Franks, once gone, live again, not in museums, not in textbooks, but in multiplayer lobbies, in YouTube videos, in the heated finals of Red Bull Wololo tournaments. They've become a digital culture. It's fascinating, really. We once feared the erasure of old civilizations. We built museums, wrote encyclopedias, filmed documentaries to preserve what was fading. But in the age of gaming, something radical has occurred. We've made history playable. Millions of players, young and old, now learn about Frankish legacy not through lectures, but through battles fought in real time. They memorize the bonuses, learn the timelines, and understand, intuitively, what made the Franks special. Farming efficiency? That's Carolingian. Infrastructure. Cavalry strength? That's the legacy of Clovis and Charlemagne. Stone castles? That's 11th century French warfare brought to life. This is cultural preservation disguised as entertainment. And in that space, the Franks thrive. They're not just a footnote anymore. They're a faction, a meta pick, a favorite CV. But beyond the game mechanics, beyond the stats and updates, lies the deeper question. Why do we still care about the Franks? Why do they matter in a world run by algorithms and satellites? Because they remind us of something timeless. That power, real power, comes from vision, from unity, from daring to build something greater than yourself. Charlemagne did it with a crown and a sword. Napoleon did it with artillery and ambition. And now, gamers do it with strategy and skill. Different tools, same dream. The dream of empire, of legacy, of shaping history, not just reading it. And maybe, just maybe, that's the true lesson of the Franks. Not how they lived, not how they conquered, but how they refused to be forgotten. So next time you launch Age of Empires this too, and scroll through the civilization list, stop for a second when you see the Franks. Remember their journey, from tribal warriors to imperial rulers to digital legends. And when you click Start Game, know this: you're not just choosing a civ, you're reviving a legacy. Let the Paladins ride. If you've enjoyed this journey through time and legend, don't let the story end here. Hit subscribe to join Lost Throne, where every fallen empire leaves a trail, and every trail leads to another forgotten world waiting to be uncovered. New chapters every week. Only for those who still believe history isn't dead, it's just waiting to be played.